Well, we do launch into this new season of teaching through June, and we'll be looking at this at our Explorer group on Tuesday. Also, there are like a study guide on our app and website that you can sort of follow along some questions if you want to kind of reflect on what all of this is about, and I'll explain that a bit later. We're going to be in Romans chapter 8 for today, and then we'll sort of look at various aspects and all of that. But a way to maybe cycle into this particular message is this way. A friend of mine told me about an experience he had when he was flying. He wasn't flying the plane, but he was a passenger on a plane, something that many of us have not done for several years. And when he got on this particular flight, the pilot came on the little speaker thing. I don't know his name. It could be Alf. It could be, it's the only pilot I know, Captain Stubing, I have no idea. But he came on the thing, you know, and made his announcement. And the announcement was this. He said, "Welcome aboard to flight, whatever we're going here." And he said, "I'll be Alf, your pilot. And after 29 years of flying this particular route, I am retiring. And this flight is my final and last flight." My friend told me that the crowd on the airplane clapped and cheered to honour this guy because he'd, you know, flown these flights and for 29 years, and this was his last one. And then we got talking about this story about this guy and the many thousands of hours he would have had to put into preparing and actually flying the plane. And we talked about what if the reverse had happened or a different announcement was made. That if a pilot came on and they weren't a person of 29 years experience, and they made the announcement, "Welcome on board such and such a flight to such and such a place. And this, you should know, is my very first flight." Do you think there would be clapping and cheering in the aisles? They say everybody has an appointed time to die. And when you fly, you trust it's not the pilot's. Why I tell you that nonsense story is that we want to trust the person who is flying the plane. We want to trust the person who is running the show. We want to know, is there someone flying this thing or leading this thing who is competent, and do they know what they are doing? When it comes to our doctor or our kids' teachers or politicians or dentists or pastors, do we want to know, is the person who is appointed to lead able to do what they claim? And ultimately that question sort of projects onto God. Is there someone who is flying this universe, if you like, ordering this world, ordering this life in a way that I can trust? Now, at times when life is going well, as we sang, when the sun's shining down on me and life's all that it should be, we say, absolutely, God is in control, God is in his heaven, I am upon this earth, everything's fine. But it is when the road is marked with some suffering and some trouble that we maybe don't applaud so loudly. Does he know what he is doing? And am I at risk, or am I just at the mercy of my own circumstances? So we're launching into this month of looking at life happens. We're going to look at life happening, grace happening, guidance happening, and then trouble happening. But we're going to do it sort of hinged on a verse from the book of Romans, Romans 8 and verse 28. Whether we like it or not, life happens. John Lennon is attributed to have said these words, that life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans. I don't know if he was the originator of that particular saying, but we sort of do that. But in the 81.2 years that an average male will live in Australia, or in the 85.3 years that an average woman will live in Australia, the life expectancy, means I worked it out, I've got 25.1 years left if I live to average. What are we going to do with this life, and how are we going to posture the life that happens to us, often while we're making other plans? So, see, one of the primary illusions of our culture and our life is this particular illusion. And the illusion is that I am in control, I am in charge, I am self-sufficient, I run my life, I do it my way. That feeling has been around ever since the first. William Ernest Henley said and wrote that famous poem, The Master of My Fate. I am the master of my fate, the captain of my soul. And that can be very easily accommodated when life is going well. But what do we do when the risk in our life seems to outweigh the reward? What do we do in life when trouble comes? What do we do in life when guidance doesn't seem so clear? What do we do when life happens? What do we do? Because we go along our life and then something happens. A blood vessel bursts, a cell reproduces in a body, someone's driving a car, someone misses a stop sign. In an instant, life becomes terribly clear that we are not in control, no matter how much we pull on the risk and reward levers. Life happens, birth happens, growth happens, good times happen, trouble happens, suffering happens, growth happens, and ultimately the end of our mortal life happens. So with all of that stuff, the Apostle Paul makes a very bold and very misunderstood statement. It's in Romans chapter 8 and verse 20. That's where we're going to be today. And he talks about all kinds of different things before that, and I'll talk about that a bit later. But he says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose.
Holy words of our faith.
those words, and particularly 3 words, and then the following 2. And the 3 words I want us to concentrate are these words: in all things. I wonder how much we really believe that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. Because it's really important, because it really forms our theology, our understanding of God. Because if God is not involved in all the things, then he may as well not be involved in any of the things. It really shapes our understanding of God. I was talking to a young guy today. I used to say young guys are in their 20s, but this young guy's in his mid-30s. And his mum is just being diagnosed with cancer of the lung, and it's pretty much through that whole part of her body. And the prognosis is not good at all. In fact, I don't know why doctors put time limits on it, but they're saying that she will be, with treatment, fortunate to see out this year. I was talking to this guy, rang me and said, can I talk, and can we have a coffee and talk through all that stuff? He's a lovely young man. And I said to him, how are you doing with all this, as pastors say to people? And he said, I'm in shock. And then he said a sentence I don't think he meant, but people say in those sort of circumstances. He said, I'm still in shock because I love my mum. And this kind of thing, just doesn't happen to our family. And we went on and finished the coffee, and he went on his way and I went on. But I thought about that last bit of his sentence. This kind of thing just doesn't happen to our family. Sometimes it's tempting for people of faith, particularly people who are Christ followers, to go along this kind of rationale. If I become a Christ follower, a Christian, there are certain circumstances that just will not happen to me, that will happen to other people. And I am protected and immunised, to use a commonly used word at the moment, from the stuff that happens to other people but not to me. So I'm immune from those circumstances. Those kinds of things just don't happen to us, to me. When we get that idea and that theology, if you like, that we are immune to life happening to us, sometimes we have to rethink that, particularly when those things that we thought don't happen to people like us happen. And our understanding of God is kind of blown out of the water a bit, or a lot. Paul says in all things. In other versions that you have, it'll say all circumstances. The idea here is that all things and all circumstances happen to people who believe in God, but all things and all circumstances happen to people who are yet to believe in God. Because the Bible says there will be a day when everybody will believe in God. There will be a day when the truth will be made known, that every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. So there is this good stuff that happens in life, and there is this difficult or bad stuff that happens in life. And the experience of life is that we all get a taste of each. But here's the problem that quite often rears its head. If I become a Christian, that means that there is more good stuff than bad stuff that is supposed to happen to me as kind of a compensation package for believing the right things. And so our theology of God changes, where God becomes a sort of a celestial insurance provider. You know what I mean? An entity that cocoons us from the difficult things of life. Well, that's certainly not my experience and not my understanding of God. And there is a great mystery around this, why good things happen to bad people and why bad things happen to good people and everything in between. A very good writer on this sort of stuff is a guy called Henry Nouwen. And you may have read some of his stuff. And he said this. He said, often a little criticism makes me angry, and a little rejection makes me depressed. A little praise raises my spirits, and a little success excites me. It takes very little to raise me up or to thrust me down. And then he used this image. He said, often I am like a small boat on an ocean, completely at the mercy of the waves. You ever been through seasons of life where you feel like that? I do. All the time and energy I spend in keeping some kind of balance and preventing myself from being tipped over and drowning shows that my life is mostly a struggle for survival not a holy struggle, but an anxious struggle resulting from a mistaken idea that it is the world that defines me. That it is the world that defines me. Well, when we come into a relationship with God, our definition of the world changes. But still, the hardest stuff of life happens. The statement that Paul, the apostle, is making is not that more good stuff than bad stuff is going to happen, but that in all things, and that's where the next couple of words come from, that in all things God is at work, that God works. Paul makes this statement about the nature of things. He sees that everything, and he talked about that in Romans and the early chapters, that everything in this world is bondage to decay. In other words, everything that is shiny will taint. Everything that is new will become old. Everything that is familiar will become unfamiliar. It is bonded and bondage to decay. And sometimes some people will think things like, well, everything's going to work out, everything's okay, and we've got a great Australian saying for it, that is no worries, and she'll be right, whoever she is. She'll be right. Often I think it's like that, I was saying on Tuesday, it's often like that scene out of one of the Monty Python movies with the knight who's having limbs taken off him and he's saying, I'm fine. That's not just a British thing, sometimes that's bad theology, you know. Sometimes, folks, things do fall apart. Sometimes relationships do end. Sometimes we do have trouble in this life. And the quicker we grow up and get our heads around that in our own lives, the better we'll understand God and not feel so resentful that we haven't been cocooned from the hard thing in life. So the promise is not that all things will work out. The promise is not things work together for good. The promise is in all things, God works. That God is infinitely bigger than the circumstances we find ourselves in. I was rereading Isaiah 40. Raymond spoke so great on that for a couple of weeks ago back. And one of the great images about that is God who is bigger than the circumstances that we have. And it describes God in this way. God who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand. That's where we got that kid's song, you know, he's got the whole world in his hands. Who measured the waters in the hollow of his hands, measured heaven with the span, and calculated the dust of the earth in a measure. He weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in the balance. If you read through Isaiah 40, you get these great images of God's greatness. God made all of that and it all fits in the hollow of his hand. Without that picture of God, then we just live in this giant universe with a much smaller God. But the Bible describes God as a giant God in a universe that fits inside the hollow of his hand. So the question for us is, do we still believe that God is still working? In all things, is this great God still working? And when he does work, is it for the good, even though on face value it doesn't seem so good? Well, I'm like you. I would rather wake up and have some really good circumstances in my life. None of us wake up and go, Lord, give me a really bad day so I can grow spiritually today, please. Give me a whole heap of conflict. Give me a whole heap of negative encounters with people on the road and at the shops and at cafes and in my job. Really tease out this great growth pattern that I want. Nobody likes that at all. If you do, well, I think we need to talk, you know. You need to talk to somebody at least. The promise Paul makes here is not that good stuff is always going to happen to you or to me or to us even as a community, but the good news is that God will always be for the good even if the stuff is going to be bad. For we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. In other words, we are in a process of growth, and often, sadly, regrettably, the best way we grow is through the tension of hard stuff. But the promise of Philippians 1:6 is that he, that is God, who has begun something in you, begun this good work in you, he will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. God's plan is not that we just have good circumstances. I think of my own kids, and you kind of think, well, what do I really want for them? People ask me all the time, what do you want most for your kids? And like a reflex, I say, oh, I don't really care what they do. I just want them to be happy. Well, that's kind of a false statement, isn't it? Because if they do whatever they want to do, then they pursue a happiness that actually doesn't last beyond the circumstances they find themselves in. But God is in the work for the good. He is in the game in our lives for the long haul. God's plan is not that we just simply have good circumstances, and God is a God who wants to give his children good things. Don't misunderstand that at all. It's just that above our circumstances, he wants us to develop the character of his Son, Jesus Christ, to have the fruit of the same Spirit that came on the day of Pentecost, that produced in people a difference. It produced love and joy and peace and kindness and goodness and gentleness and self-control. God has something much better at work to complete in you what he is destined to complete in you. So God promises to use all the stuff that happens to us to produce good stuff, so that in the character that Jesus of us, that is in us through the Spirit, will have lasting effects, not just in our own lives, but in the lives that we encounter. Paul wrote these words to the apostle because he himself was a person who woke up every day as a Jewish man saying the same words every morning and every night. He said what was called the Shema from Deuteronomy. And here's the words he would pray every morning. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Paul woke up saying those words. He went to bed at night saying those words. It reinforced this God is a God who wants to be loved. And that was a striking piece of news for the ancient world. Because gods were just there to be appeased and pleased and sacrificed to. There's a great book I read years ago called The Divine Conspiracy. And it says this, I haven't got a slide for it. It says, the acid test for any theology is the God presented one that can be loved heart, soul, mind and strength? If the thoughtful answer is no, then we really need to look elsewhere. It does not matter really how sophisticated or intellectually or doctrinally we approach it. If it fails to set a lovable God, a radiant, happy, friendly, accessible, totally competent God, then we have gone wrong. We should not keep going in the same direction, but turn around and take another road. See, God is lovable and God is love. And you are lovable, even though at times you think you are not. Even though at times you've been told you are not. You are lovable and valuable. In all things, God works for the good for those who love him. Well, there's one question that is unanswered in that statement is, what is God going to do for people who don't yet love him? You know, Jesus talked about the rain, and he said that God causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Sometimes we look at that verse or hear that verse and we think, well, that means that everybody's kind of under the same kind of banner, you know, that rain, it sucks to get wet and all that. But rain and sun was actually a sign of blessing. So there's a certain level in which God blesses us, even with the breath that we take in. That life is a gift to every human being that has drawn breath. That's why we should value every human being, as hard as that is at times, who draws breath, because they are valuable enough to God to create them. God sends the rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. He blesses people even despite their distance from him. But God is at work for the good of those who love him. God's also at work for the good of those who don't yet love him. He's constantly at work for the good of every being that he has made. And therefore we love him. When you go to work, when there's a traffic jam, when there's frustration, when you get criticised, when the Raiders lose, when you get discouraged, when you get afraid, when you get uncertain, there's enough blessing to go around. So the question we need to ask in our circumstances as a church, and we will be asking in the next couple of months in particular, how is God at work in this thing now, this circumstance we find ourselves in? We could reach back for the old, as Kimberly said, and criticise the old, but we are where we are now, and you are where you are now. So we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. Let's be a people, a community that radiates with the goodness and love of God, that accepts that in life, sometimes life happens and hard things happen. But instead of judging that as some sort of behaviour modification problem, that we say, okay, this is a bad circumstance, let's stand with each other in that circumstance. That in all things we know that God works for good. But to not disregard the good things also, and to keep speaking about the goodness and the greatness of God.